Danse, Kapapamaskum Ganakasqueo, Nitsigasun, Otsinia Michel First Nation, Nia Hudnashoni Nehia Esqueo. I'm Bear Clan. My Mohawk family name is Garaguante. My Cree name is Kapapamaskum Ganakasqueo, which means she who walks on the earth until her hair turns gray. I want to thank the folks for inviting me here to share some of my thoughts around homelessness with you today. And I want to also acknowledge folks who've inspired me through my journey. And Agrawal is a very influential thinker who influenced my thinking as I was going through university. Johnny, who keeps me on my toes as I attend community events. Alex, who's there in the community, who's always a smiling face to assure me to keep going. And Patty from Native Counseling Services, who's been a trailblazer, who's led the way for folks like me to follow. So I'm grateful for all of you who've contributed to some of my thinking. Before I came here, I just spent 6 days in the bush in Whitecourt, 3 days with senior high school students and 3 days with junior high students. And we were on the land and it rained and the rain was pouring down our faces, and we had just shot a moose and the moose was hanging and the old people were down with the kids cutting the dry meat and they were hanging the meat on the rack, and on the fire pit we were cooking fresh moose and tea and we're eating moose and chewing that smoke and that blood taste, and the boys were singing hand drum songs. And it was a beautiful, loving experience. And that is our happy place. That is where we gather when we hunt, when we feast. And those moose were cut up so quickly and divided by family because people are hungry. Our families are starving, they're suffering. And so when we think about homelessness, it's not just not having a home, it's also not having food to nourish your body, not having access to your traditional foods. And those traditional foods don't only nourish your body, but they nourish your spirit. You know, our DNA recognizes those things because our relatives ate those things. They ate the rabbit, the fish, the berries, the saskatoons, the blueberries. And then our ancestors, they get decomposed and it grows back in the bushes, it grows back in the animals as they eat those willows, and when we consume those, our DNA recognizes that, and there's this magical thing that happens, is that you get this feeling of contentment and this feeling of peace and love. And so it's not just eating, it's not just food, it's nourishing your spirit. And so when we think about homelessness, we also need to think about home broader than just a couch or just a safe place to go. It's how are we able to nourish our spirits in a safe way? Homelessness impacts our community, as I'm sure you know, tremendously, from the legacy of the Indian residential schools to the 60 scoop to our kids in child welfare. There are more children in child welfare across Canada than there ever was. There's over 35,000 children from Indigenous homes that are living with non-Indigenous parents, being raised without their language, being raised without their food source, being raised without their identity. That also contributes to the beginning of homelessness. When you don't have your mom, your dad, your siblings, your mushums, your cookums to teach you to sit with you on the ground, on the wet ground while the rain is coming down on you, and you're learning to cut that meat. That's home, right? To be with your family, to do those things. And if you don't get to experience those things, homelessness starts to become part of your identity at a very young age. And so our children going up in foster care often end up in our institutions. They often end up in jail. And when they get out of jail, they don't particularly have somewhere to go. They didn't connect to anyone growing up in the system. And so when they come out, they end up on the streets. And when we have trauma, and we have complex trauma in our families, from the abuse and the legacy of Indian residential schools, from the removal of being stolen away from our families and our communities, along with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety disorder, addictions, and then you add poverty on top of that, being poor, being poor in food, being poor in friendship, being poor in love, because you are completely depleted of all things, because there's been nothing there to fill it. There's been nothing there to nourish you. There's been a whole structure, a whole system in Canada to make sure that you fit into a place, but it's not home. And so I commend each and every one of you for being here, because part of your work is how do we change this system? And you're here because you believe that it's possible to change this system. And so how do we work together with Indigenous communities? How do we work together with systems that are broken? How can we make things better together? We talked earlier, my group, around relationships, and Wakotowin in our Cree language is primary, it is foundational. Our relationships to each other, our relationships to the land, our relationships to the water, to the four-leggeds, the two-leggeds. So our relationships to each other. So when we think about the work that lies ahead, because it's really big work, when we think about the TRC calls to action, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, all of which are being implemented, we question, how do we do this? This seems so huge. We have these massive frameworks and all of these calls, and 94 fits here and 31 fits here, and we're going to check the box here. But if we don't have relationships with each other, none of those things matter. They won't work. If we don't know who each other is, how each other thinks, what makes each other's worlds matter to each other, none of that stuff will work. So we have to go back to figuring out where each other's coming from, which means understanding each other's worldview. When we're in a university, in an institution, we are coming from a Western worldview. Indigenous people live in an Indigenous worldview. And our Indigenous worldview, we have work to do internally as well because of the fragment. And so part of your role as non-Indigenous folks is how can we listen? How can we support as you repair? And then how do we engage meaningfully in a relationship? And part of that is how do we step away from a resource extraction model? Because I see the truth and reconciliation calls to action often looking like a resource extraction model. So what we are doing is we are checking boxes and taking resources out of community, out of their context, into institution, into places and spaces. So we have land acknowledgements. So we have elders speaking here. So we are doing this, 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 and this. What are we doing to put back into that place that we are recognizing as broken? What are we putting back into that community where we're taking that elder? What are we putting back to those children while we're taking away their teachers so that we have somebody here in fancy institutions? And I see it all over the country. And so ask yourself, what are we doing that's not based on a resource extraction model? How are we giving to Indigenous peoples so that we can lift them? Because we are suffering in our communities. We are living in houses with 2 to 3 families. We have boil water advisories in Alberta. Earlier it was mentioned by Johnny, we're one of the richest nations, one of the richest territories in the country. Why do we have 6 boil water advisories in Alberta alone? If they were Ukrainian communities, if they were Muslim communities, if they were Japanese communities in Canada, would that be acceptable that they had boil water advisories? We have to take a look at the racism. And that's a hard thing to do. And I've been fortunate to work with the Edmonton Shift Lab, where we started to look at the intersection of racism and poverty. We have to have the tough conversations about our history, about colonization, about the way Indigenous people have been portrayed in our history, about the way the knowledge of Indigenous people has been represented, that somehow it's less than white knowledge, white systems, that somehow the way Indigenous people govern themselves is not as exemplary as the Parliament or the way we have constitutions, that our constitutions, our flag songs, aren't as great or as outstanding as O Canada. Right? We have to start to question these things. How have Indigenous peoples recognized each other, recognized their land, their resources, their obligations and responsibilities to each other? And when we start to figure out, oh, okay, we have a different way of engaging, you have a different way of engaging, Then we can start to build that really solid relationship so we can move forward and address reconciliation and address the calls to action and make some headway on homelessness and make some headway in putting some children back with their families, some adults back in their communities, repairing some of that harm that has been, it's the legacy of Canada. It's the legacy of cultural genocide. And so Canada is coming to terms with the fact that we have been living in a genocidal country, and it's uncomfortable to think how great our country is, that we are doing terrible things. Reservations are like internment camps of poverty. People don't have food in their fridge. That moose went so fast because people finally had some food. And I see out there, we have leftover sandwiches and salad and cakes. We're privileged here in our comfortable homes. Those kids, they didn't have boots because they couldn't afford them, so they're running around in the mud with Ziploc bags. That's a reality. This is Alberta. The resources that have made this province rich come off Indigenous lands. And so how are we giving back to those future generations? Currently in Alberta and in every other province in Canada, there's provincial education curriculum. There's a standard. So when you graduate from grade 12, you can have English 30-1 and you can apply for high school. On reserve system, because they're federally funded systems, there's English 30-4. You can't apply to any post-secondary with English 30-4. So why are the children on reserves not eligible for the same level of grade 12 as other children in this province? So when we think about homelessness and poverty, we know education's a way out. We know that education supports families, supports individuals in thriving and being well. So why is it in Alberta we have a substandard level of education? It's 2018. I don't understand it. I have an undergraduate degree. I'm completing my master's. I'm a relatively educated person. I spend time in communities, and I see the poverty. I see the lice outbreak because people can't afford the nicks, or the bed bug outbreaks because families don't have the skills or the knowledge to cope with that. And then their children are apprehended, not because they're bad parents, but because they're poor. So the system is broken. And I'm hopeful, and seeing each and every one of you here, plant seeds of hope that you're going to join me, my families, my community in changing things, not only in Edmonton, but in Alberta. Indigenous people on the reserves, Indigenous people in urban spaces. We need partnerships, we need relationships. We can't get out of this mess alone, because it almost feels hopeless sometimes. The poverty, the homelessness, the boiling your water before you brush your teeth to go to a school that's not even going to provide you with an education to get you to college. We need you to advocate to your leaders, to your politicians. Write letters. Why is education at a substandard level? Why are there boil water advisories? Why are these children being apprehended from their families? Why are we not doing resource sharing from the province with Indigenous communities? And I put that upon you today in hopes that maybe you'll take forward something with you as you think about the TRC calls to action or the United Nations Declaration, that maybe you'll just do a simple act as easy as writing a letter, because that letter can go a very long way in our white system, so to speak, because they read those letters. They have to, that's their job, and they respond to those letters. And the more letters, the more people who care, the more likely we are to change the system together. And so seeing you all here provides me with hope that together we can change this broken system, and that the children in my community will stop being apprehended, and that they will come home and they will find their home. And then we can nourish them, not only their bodies, but their spirits. And we can reduce homelessness by bringing our babies back. And when our babies come back, then our adults grow up in our communities. And then they don't end up on the streets being addicts. because it reduces that harm, because we grew up nourished, we grew up loved, and we grew up belonging somewhere. And so I ask each and every one of you humbly to do something, to write a letter, to make a phone call, whatever it takes, whatever you feel inspired to do, because we need help. We need help to change the broken system. And I'm really grateful to have the time to share that with all of you. I left this morning, the snowstorm and the kids. It was a mud bog, and I have a small car, and I was stuck, and you can imagine all these little Indian kids jumping up and down on my car trying to get me stuck out of the mud to get here to you. I was covered in mud, but it was a beautiful thing. It was a beautiful thing to have those babies out on the land, is sleeping in teepees and in trappers' cabins. And at 4:30 this morning, I was up putting firewood in each of their cabins. There was 12 of them and 6 teepees. And I walked around, and it was such a loving thing for me to be able to do, to be able to open, sneak in them when they're sleeping and put in that wood in the stove, and can hear the crackling of the spruce, and you can smell the spruce. And to see those babies sleeping and under the stars and in the air, and you could hear the rain, and it was really magical. And I want to be able to do that for more of our kids, for more of those kids in care, for those kids, for those adults who are in the institution. It would be such a beautiful gift to be able to bring them home so we can nourish not only their bodies, but their spirits. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Safe travels to your home fires today. Ti miigwech.